Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to welcome you back to this channel. I am Professor Oriaso Dongo, and this channel is Professor Oriaso Dongo's Knowledge Hub. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to today talk to you about climate change legislation. Now, under climate change legislation, allow me to be specific to climate change policies, conventions, and treaties, because they are important. And I want to break down this presentation into around 4 or 5 sections. In the first instance, I'll be able to tell you about the scope of climate change legislations. The second instance, I want to tell you about the major disasters that led to the climate change legislations. And then the third one, I want to give you a sneak peek of the origins of climate change legislations. And then the third one, I will give you a rundown on the major milestones in climate change legislations. And then I'll give you some of the examples of national and regional legislations that we have. And I will be specific to some international ones like the Montreal Protocol, the Vienna Conventions, and all that. And then lastly, I'll tell you something about how we domesticate international legislations so that we can use them to inform adaptation and mitigation. So ladies and gentlemen, let me start by saying that we know what legislations are about, what conventions, treaties do. In the context of climate change, these treaties, these conventions, these protocols, they normally bind the international community towards addressing climate change. We know very well that climate change, the way we have talked about it, being a global phenomenon, and we have said that it is greatly being caused by human activities. I think we have been able to talk about that. So legislations that we are talking about will reinforce to a large extent the commitment that the international community will have towards the fight against this climate change. Now, these legislations, where do they come from? So the initial legislations can be traced back to the work of IPCC. I think I've talked about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now you can imagine, you can remember the IPCC was the first panel to be created after research in the 1970s gave damning report that climate change and ozone depletion was real. Remember the study I had cited from the World Meteorological Association. So then from the IPCC, then we had the formation of, from the IPCC, we had the formation of the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I think you remember that. And the main aim of climate change policy at that time was to be able to check particularly the behaviors of developed nations and with regard to what they could do to manage or to address climate change. And during this time, today we normally don't just talk about developed nations. We talk about all nations, whether they are developed, whether they are least developed, or whether they are developing nations, because we have been able to say that climate change is a common phenomenon that affects and originates from across the globe. So these legislations could not have originated from nowhere. There are major things that we can point at in history that led to their formation. You can imagine talking about the global disasters. So what are some of those global disasters and evidences that we have that led to the United Nations and all parties agreeing to fight climate change through those legislations? Look at, for example, the ozone layer depletion. The findings that the ozone layer had already been perforated. And so the climate change was actually real. So that made the people go into the overdrive to begin to commit themselves to do this. The global climate change that was due to intensified greenhouse gas emissions. And people also experienced rising sea levels and changing rainfall intensity. So things began to happen across the globe. And this made people to attend to these issues. The radioactive wastes that were coming from leakages that we have, we can mention them in history. We talk about the oil spill, you can remember that. The results of atomic bombs that happened, the accidents that happened in various nuclear sites across the globe, environmental impact of war and all those that caused a lot of damage. And then the spill from stockpiles of old weapons. I think you look at that, I mentioned about the oil spill. We have also been able to see the natural disasters like earthquakes, floods, storm, volcanic activities across the globe. And so these ones were able to point to the fact that there was danger. There was food insecurity in a number of places, for example, the Horn of Africa, North Korea, and everything. We also had migration, we had funny diseases. We also experienced water scarcity and pollution, and even groundwater contaminations. There was an increasing international river usage. So the rivers that normally feed oceans and seas had problems. Problems with soil erosion was being experienced everywhere. Problems with salinization, chemical destruction of land. I think these are things that we have mentioned previously. Issues to do with deforestation and the widespread desertification. I think we have mentioned that. Don't forget the human migration because of hazardous wastes that are there, and controlled human population, conflicts, biodiversity loss, and so many things that we experience, including even fish depletion in oceans, in rivers, in lakes because of overfishing and that. We also experience rampant fires across. You can remember the one which is documented in Indonesia and Amazon and Mediterranean, and the occurrence of alien plants. We still have those alien plants, like we talk about the water hyacinth, for example, in East Africa, and we talk about quite a number of those foreign. And then the reemergence of drug resistance, and all these ones were traceable, and people thought like these ones were direct impacts caused by climate change. People also experienced poverty across the globe, and there was a widening gap between the rich and the poor, something like that. The increasing insensitivity and use of chemical fertilizers. These ones were very destructive that made people to begin to think about this. So the first climate change legislation, as it were, ladies and gentlemen, began from the UNFCCC that I talked about. And this UNFCCC, being the first embodiment of legislations checking climate change, was commissioned in 1992. Remember, I've also been able to put this across somewhere. And putting it across, people thought like state parties to the treaties like that were supposed to act. But by 1995, people had thought temperatures would even reduce a little bit. It had not reduced. So by 1997, we talked about the Kyoto Protocol was adopted to legally bind the developed nations. I think I had mentioned that this one was exclusively for developed nations that were blamed to have been the ones responsible for very high tons of carbon emissions. So Kyoto Protocol then had the first commitment in 2008-2012, and the second commitment was over the period where we now had the Paris Agreement, 2013 to 2020. And the Kyoto Protocol I just mentioned had got around 192 state parties, and just too shy of the 195 members of the UNFCCC. So you can imagine that. So UNFCCC works with Secretariat to support all issues around climate change, legislations, negotiations, and efforts. And those kind of elements it has, we have the Conference of Parties, the COP or COP. We have been able to get that quite a lot. And then we also have the Conference of Meeting of Parties, CMP. And then we have a subsidiary body which advises COP and CMP. You can imagine, plus a bureau. This bureau is the one that deals with procedural issues that arise from day-to-day activities of UNFCCC. So then when I look at the climate change legislation in terms of the major milestones, from the time climate change was found to have begun all the way to the present, then I can quickly run you through those major milestones. I'll put them here. So the major milestones that we have, number one could be 1979, when the World Climate Conference took place the first time. So after that, in 1988, we had the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change being created, or being formed, that is IPCC. So after the IPCC was created, IPCC did research and came up with the first assessment report. And this report was released, and during this time, IPCC and the World Climate Conference called for a global treaty because the results were damning. They had indicated that things were getting worse. So the UN, through the UN General Assembly, picked up. And then the first meeting of that intergovernmental negotiation committee took place in 1991. So in 1992, we had the INC adopting the UNFCCC text as it was in what I had referred to early as the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. So you can imagine that. So then UNFCCC then opened for signatures. So in 1994, UNFCCC then entered into force, and in 1995, the first conference of party takes place in Berlin. You can imagine that. Then in 1996, we had the UNFCCC having its secretariat set up to take up actions and support the framework. And then in 1997, we had Kyoto Protocol being formally adopted in COP3 meeting. And then in 2001, we had the release of the third IPCC assessment report. And then the Bonn Agreement was adopted based on the Buenos Aires Action Plan. I think you can look at that. And then in 2005, the Kyoto Protocol then entered into force. And the first meeting of Kyoto Protocol parties then happened in Montreal, Canada. And then 2007, we had the release of the fourth IPCC report. And then 2010, we had the CANCAM agreement that was drafted by COP16. And 2011, we had the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action. I think you can see that at COP17. And in 2012, the Doha Amendment to the Kyoto Protocol was drafted. And then 2013, we had key decisions that were made at COP19 and CMP9, which included a number of issues that I will not wish to talk about today. Then in 2015, now we have the magic Paris Agreement with so many things. So you can look at the historical development of the legislations around climate change. Allow me now to go into telling you something more about the national and regional conventions. And I have said previously that national legislations are supposed to support the international efforts that are put in place. In the same way, the regional conventions and efforts are also supposed to be supported by national legislations. So although we are talking about a number of factors which are affecting the implementation of these international regulations, the central thing that is important here is the national legislation that are put in place. And we know that when a country has committed itself and has become part of the global community that will now be working in unison to fight climate change, then many things have to happen at home. And even when these things happen at home, that country does not live in isolation of its colleagues, particularly the blocs, the regional blocs. Now, the regional blocs are normally very instrumental when it comes to negotiations, because when countries go to negotiate, particularly these policies, legislations at global levels, they tend to go in as regions because they normally support one another. Take, for example, East Africa. Take, for example, Central Africa, West Africa, and we have so many regions that are doing this. And the countries normally decide to form part of the global community because of a number of things. And so then it is important because national interest and perceived national interest is important. You see countries agreeing to be part of the global community and you wonder, why are they part of the global communities? So countries normally join that because of the various interests that they have. Or sometimes, other than the interest, they also look at they do domestic assessment of the risk that is caused by climate change. So if the risk is high, or if the country has got no institutions to be able to withstand the shocks, they quickly sign and ratify all this. And the other one is if, for example, the legislations that are supposed to be adopted, supposed to be implemented, are not at loggerheads with the interest of that country. And so sometimes countries just decide to comply because they know what they are doing. Maybe if they are carbon intensive, they do the CBA and decide that because we are already this way, so we need to work towards changing our life circumstances. Sometimes political influence also affect a country's commitment to these global legislations that we are talking about. And the others could be opportunity which are close to the climate agenda, particularly when the benefits of mitigation or adaptation is there, then countries will just comply. The other factor, apart from the national interest, could be competitiveness. Sometimes countries will commit because of the positions of their key trading partners, for example, their competitors. Take, for example, Canada and the US. They have always held similar positions with regard to negotiations at that level. And you remember this partnership has got its history. The other factor could be the peers and the negotiating groups. So we say that countries tend to negotiate as groups at the UNFCCC. And you can imagine that developing nations will tend to negotiate as G77. That's a fact. Plus China has always been able to support them. Small island countries are also being able to join together and negotiate as units. You don't forget even developed nations like E27, European Union 27, tend to do that. So the fourth factor that determines how we adopt or implement the global legislations could be population and leadership. This is how a country wishes to be viewed at international level. Some countries are supposed to be viewed as maybe democratic, friendly, authoritarian, etc. And there is a reason for that. So sometimes when countries do whatever they do, they pay attention to leadership and population. And when it comes to some of the instruments that are used at national level, particularly we would be calling them instruments that support international legislations. We know very well that international legislations cannot make sense if we do not have supporting mechanisms in our countries. Look, for example, at the national constitutions that we are having. So constitutions that we have should be supportive of these international legislations for them to make sense. Look at even the various statutes, like we have several environmental statutes or climate change statutes in our countries. And I believe these are made in a manner that accepts or support the adoption and implementation of these international legislations. Even sessional papers by parliaments, or even reports from working groups will be very instrumental national legislations. We also have national adaptation action plans. You can imagine, look at that. National climate change action plans that we are having. National climate change policy frameworks, we are having that. As well as national climate change response strategies. And don't forget what we had said, like the NAPAs. Initially, the NAPAs, the NDCs, nationally determined contributions that we have mentioned, the national communications and all. Can you look at all that? I don't want to give much detail about the NAPAs and what they were supposed to do, and even the NDCs, and now the NDCs, and then the national communications. And when it comes to regional policies now, I was just talking about the national ones. Let me mention about the regional policies. We say that climate change policies are mostly discussed, we discuss them at national level. But the main driver to their successful implementation could arguably be the regional bodies. And you can make reference to the UNFCCC and even the Kyoto Protocol. And you tend to check how various regions have been able to adopt them and then work in unison to implement an aspect of them that they think is of their interest. So the bulk of impacts of climate change are also happening at regional level. It is not possible that climate change can just hit one country at the exclusion of those other countries with which it is in the same region. You can look at that. So regional level have also high potential resources that can be used to address climate change, as it were. So there's need for cooperation at regional levels, so that even as we have our national internal mechanisms, we also have very strong regional commitment, regional cooperation that will do this. And then we want to ask, so what is the role of regions, particularly in climate change policy, for example? So we have all these countries of the world exist in regions, for example. So regions guarantee participation of all parties because of the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. You see, once you have been labeled like you are the key emitters of greenhouse gases, you work alone and perish. You work together and address the issues together. If we want to have proper implementation and coordination of these policies, then the region can be the best place. If, for example, we want to have these issues also being picked up through participation of the local communities, local people, and even tailor the mitigation and adaptation to people's interests, then you think about the regional way. Regions are also having less bureaucracy, as it were. And regions, to a large extent, do not have legal identity. But I will give exceptions to that statement. So regions normally identify priorities and they even come up with local solutions. We have had instances of good examples from various regions with regard to how to deal with the decisions which are made at international level with regard to climate change. So regions also link policy areas that need to be coordinated. So you can imagine that they play an important role in citizen consultation. They work with a network of others. I think that is belabored. So regions play a major role in global policy because regions network amongst themselves. They also partner with key agencies. For example, the UNDP, UNEP. You find them easily working together with established regional bodies. And they also support climate change, adaptation and mitigation. Regional governments set up associations, as it were, and that is a great thing about them. And regions normally have got voice, particularly when people go to international climate change negotiations. People normally speak as a voice, particularly regional voice, and they are normally heard. Regions also have observer status. They have observer status. I think I'll be able to mention a bit about that. So regions sometimes having implementing bodies to many of those treaties. So regions, however, face some challenges, particularly with regard to adoption and mainstreaming of the international climate legislations. Like I just mentioned, that they lack what we call the legal identity and person. You can check around which one does have. They also lack strong structures because they are normally funded by states or countries that have agreed to come together or to pull together as a region. They have limited financial and human resources to some extent. So we also have the different perspectives. Even within one block, we could have different approaches even to development. There could be one state or one country that is enthusiastic about adopting the policies, yet the others don't, and for obvious reasons of interest that I've been able to mention. So sometimes it is difficult to harmonize those policies. So then when you look at the regional policy instrument, we could pick some of them, those policy instruments that are developed at regional level to be able to check climate change at the level of responses of mitigation and adaptation. Like we have mentioned previously, taxation, tax exemptions, subsidies, we should not forget about them. Those are easily implementable at that level. The caps and trade systems. We have also voluntary agreements that are there. So they just agree to come up with legislation. And it's voluntary, and it can go a long way in trying to support. We also have emission standards. We have certificates, prizes and awards. We have legislations that are there. The public system infrastructure. So you can end up they can even end up having a climate mitigation or adaptation leading to a unifying infrastructural development. You could even have issues of information and training, capacity development at regional level, so that the participants from various countries are the ones that will lead efforts within the countries. And that also has been seen to promote a bit of what to improve perception of those. I wanted to take you through, ladies and gentlemen, on sector-specific regional policies. Sector-specific regional policies. I just want to mention them, particularly in the energy sector. What are some of the specific regional policies that we are talking about? Like reducing energy dependencies. We have had instances where regions have been able to come up with policy around that. Reducing production costs, something like that. Reliance on local industry, local material, using renewable energy. So those are things that we have been able to have instances where regions have promoted them. In the transport sector, for example, look at the public transport system. Look at East Africa, for example. There's a time there was supposed to be a link road, or even within the continent itself. So we have the railway system being thought about. We have the road infrastructure that is covering all these countries. Then we have quite a lot of development. So when one country within a region has been able to adopt an innovation, a technology, other countries within the same region are easily going to adopt it. And if it was about mitigating and adapting to climate change, it would go without saying. In agriculture, forestry, land use sector, we also have those. In waste management, we have also been able to talk about that. And ladies and gentlemen, let me now take you through a few of the regional agreements that we have been able to see. So I wanted to just mention some, like the Aarhus Convention on Access to Information. I think you can look at that. The one that was signed in 1998, binding 47 states in Asia and European. You can look at that. And then we also have the Alpine Convention on Sustainable Development of the Alp region. It was concentrating on that region, Alp region, just like the first one I mentioned about Aarhus Convention was restricted to that. And then we also have Convention on the Conservation of Atlantic Marine Living Resources. I think that one you have also had it. And then we also have the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty that was signed between the US and the Soviet Union. I think you look at it. And then the Asia-Pacific Partnership for Clean Development. Look at that. That's also a regional one. Asia-Pacific. You can look at that. And then we look at the Barcelona Convention for the Protection Against Pollution in the Mediterranean. And UNEP was involved in this one. You can also check that. And then we have the Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movement of hazardous wastes. You can also look at that. And then we also have the Biological Weapons Convention. The convention that was meant to prohibit development, production, and stocking of bacteriological and those kind of resources, weapons. You can look at that. Then the Bonn Convention, just check that. And then we have the Convention to combat desertification in the countries experiencing serious drought. I think that was particularly targeting Africa. And then we have those that are now more international, are the ones I just want to mention them quickly, like the Convention on Biodiversity, the Vienna Convention for Protection of Ozone Layer. I think I've been able to talk about that previously, and the Montreal Protocol that was supposed to enforce it. And then we have, as late as 2013, the Agreement on Cooperation in the Field of Environmental Protection. I think, look at that. And then the Agreement for the Establishment of African Risk Capacity that was done in Seoul, Korea. Look at all those. And then 2012, we have Agreement on the Establishment of the Global Green Growth Institute. You can look at that. And then we have a Convention on the Conservation and Management of High Seas Fisheries Resources in the North Pacific Ocean. And then we have Convention on the Establishment of the Association of Caribbean States in relation to dissolution of Netherlands and ties. And ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to stop there, and I've been able to give you a bit of those regional level, and I've been able to extend to those that are international. But I don't want to forget to highlight a few of those corporations, treaties, and conventions. Let me look at quickly at the Montreal Protocol. The reason why I'm looking at it is, I've talked about the Kyoto Protocol and the greenhouse effects, but I wanted to mention about the ozone depleting substances, and the main instrument that was used to enforce this was the Montreal Protocol. And this Montreal Protocol is an international protocol that was developed to enforce the Vienna the Vienna Convention. I think I have been able to mention that. I'll just mention. It was supposed to really support the protection of ozone layer by phasing out the production and distribution of all substances that were believed to have been responsible for ozone depletion. And it was basically enforcing the Vienna Convention, and so it is important for me to mention and spotlight a bit of the Vienna Convention. So the Vienna Convention was a multinational environmental agreement that also provided the framework for ODS, or ozone depleting substances. The convention was formed after a research that was held in the 1970s that established that the CFCs, the fluorocarbons, were responsible for ozone depletion. I think you can look at that. And then after that, this convention was pushed by the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations so that we could urgently address the ozone depletion issue that was. So the Vienna Convention was agreed in 1985, and then it entered into force in 1988. And it came up with the protocols, that is what I was talking about, called the Montreal Protocol, that was supposed to enforce it. And it ended up being signed by around 197 states. That is all UN members, the Holy See, the Cook Island, and the European Union did that. So people will normally observe that it was not a legally binding one, but it did provide framework for global efforts to protect the ozone layer. And it was enforced through the Montreal Protocol that we're talking about. Some of the provisions of these conventions are like global sharing of information that promote knowledge about the ozone. It was working with global agencies to assess harmful effects of the depleting substances. It also promoted the policies and regulations against the production and distribution of those harmful substances we're talking about. It also did create intergovernmental atmospheric experts, which were known to be meeting of ozone research managers. You can see that I also mentioned it elsewhere. Then COP uses all this information, this data that is coming from here. And then the Ozone Secretariat is also playing a secretariat in a number of meetings, particularly at COP. The Montreal meeting of parties is also there, and all that. And then I go back to the Montreal Protocol. This one was agreed in August of 1987, but it entered into force in 1989 in Helsinki. And so far, it had around 9 revisions to it, the one which took place in London, in Nairobi, in Copenhagen, in Bangkok, Vienna, Montreal, Australia, Beijing, and even Kigali, Rwanda. So we had a lot of improvements to the Montreal Protocol. And those improvements were for the good of it, so that it addressed some critical areas with regard to ODS, ozone depleting substances. So it has been very successful, and it is believed that because of the implementation, we have seen a great deal of change. Researchers have been able to say that since the implementation of all this, we've seen remarkable improvement within ozone. So the ozone holes, particularly in the Arctic and Antarctic circles, are said to be slowly recovering. And that it is expected that in the next, around 2050 or 2070s, the ozone layer will have recovered. This is what scientists are able to say. So some of the provisions of this protocol include phasing out all CFCs and all chemicals that are believed to be depleting the ozone layer. The second one is, it also bans the production and use of ozone depleting substances, like all those that I've been able to mention. It also restricts the trade in these substances, the CFCs. It restricts the trade. It also restricts even trade in controlled substances between parties that are engaging in such kind of things. It also offers financial assistance and technology transfer to developing countries so that they can see how to go around it so that they don't use these substances. So the most important thing about the Montreal Protocol goes around reducing production and the use of ODS. People say that ODS is not as frequent as it used to be, with the implementation of the Montreal Protocol, committing states and nations to implementing that. We've been able to implement alternative gases instead of those substances. We have been able to implement that. I've just said that there is evidence that ozone layer is, which had worn out, is slowly recovering. And then we're also talking about climate change mitigation efforts have been bolstered through this. And so some of the examples of those ozone depleting substances that I wanted to just mention them briefly. The CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, you can have that. Then we have HCFCs, that is hydrochlorofluorocarbons. And we have methyl bromide, carbon tetrachloride, we have hydrobromofluorocarbons. Then we have chlorobromomethane and the methyl bromomethane and all that. And some of the byproducts of those products you see there include like refrigerants, if you wanted to know them, where they're being used, the air conditioners, car air conditioners, inhalable toxic gases of aircraft, aerosol sprays and all that. So you look at all those and how they have been able to be controlled. Lastly, I wanted to get you through to the last bit on how do we domesticate. So how do we ensure that global legislations or regional legislations are implemented? This is what I want to call domestication. Remember, we had said that the origins of climate change legislations is in the international treaties and conventions that we talked about. And we even said that they are being enforced using those protocols and instruments. We talked about that. But then we had said that with regard to all these international legislations, there's a requirement that the local and national legislations be very permissive. So domestication here refers to the process of putting these international treaties and legislations, or even conventions, or even agreement into force. So if we put them into force at local level, and it's a process by which we just accept the international obligation. So if you are part of the global community and you begin to accept your responsibility and obligation, which you had signed, by putting into use that which you had signed, we say you have been able to domesticate it. And it is not a manifested thing. It is aligned with the international law principle, which says that a state party to any international treaty must ensure that its own domestic law or domestic body of law is or are consistent with the requirement of the international treaty that they have signed. So it means that if you arguably say you are a part of global community, you need to ensure that you implement the responsibility given to you. So all states which are parties to international legislation or conventions must abide by these principles. But it's quite challenging that sometimes we are part of these international legislations and we even sign them, but then when it comes to implementation, we give them a wide berth, because there is no one who will coerce you. So we don't have the big brother there to condition us, to force us to be able to do this. So even countries that have signed and ratified this and are implementing them are doing that because of the goodwill that they have at local level. And so domestication is important here as an important principle, and this freedom in doing it, even though it is one of the most important things and a requirement as a principle of international law. So we can look at the approaches of domestication. There are mainly two approaches, and this depends on the legal regime in the member state to the conventions. So we could have dualist approach, and we could have monolist approach. So if we have a dualist approach, what does that mean? It means that the treaties that you sign, which are international in nature, are supposed to be part of a separate legal system. They are separate. Of course, you sign them, but they are not within the constitution, your body of law. So you need to enact, you need to do some little legislation. so that you have what we call an act of transformation. This act of transformation will be able to make it easy for you to implement or ratify that. That is the dualism. The second one is monist. Monist is where a legal system where if you were to sign any treaty or in a national convention or legislation, then it automatically becomes part of your legal system through what we call self-execution. Look at that. I want you to read legal self-execution and look at that. But we have levels. We have extreme monist. This is where treaties that are directly applicable in state are superior, but now they are still part of the Constitution, but they are superior. Then we have moderate monist, where domestic law provides direct application of those treaties, which are of high status, but are not superior. And then we have the ambivalent one. This is where all those treaties are self-executing and directly applicable. And so you can look at that. So good people, allow me to go to the last bit of this presentation about stepwise process of domestication. So how do we envisage the process of domestication? We have steps. There are several steps. We have the first step is the drafting of the framework. Then the second step is signing of the treaty. Then after that, you exchange the instruments, which the ones I've been able to mention. Then from there, you ratify the treaty, and then you accept the treaty, and then you do the approval and accession, and then implement, and then compliance. So I think that is the stepwise process that people normally use to ratify international treaties and conventions. So good people, allow me to just recap what I have done today. Today we have been talking about climate change legislations generally, and we were concentrating a great deal on policies, conventions, and treaties, and I've been able to mention a great deal. I began by telling us about the scope of climate change legislations, and then I went into the major disasters that led us to coming up with those legislations. Then I also remember I gave a brief history of the origins of those legislations. And then I went to recapping on the major milestones of climate legislations from 1979 all the way to around 2023, 2024. And then I went to giving national and regional climate change legislations and how they look and what their roles are. And then I went to the international ones, and I gave you even examples of the Montreal Protocol, the Vienna Conventions. And I went to talking about the ratification of international legislations. And I talked about this as depending on international law principle, that if you are a state party to an international treaty or legislation, it is mandated, it is based that it's required that you must sign and ratify them. And then I went to telling you about the stepwise process of domestication. I think I've been able to mention that. And then I want to stop there, ladies and gentlemen, hoping that whatever I have presented has or will make some impact in you. And colleagues and ladies and gentlemen, don't forget to like, don't forget to share, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. I'm Professor Oriaso Dongo, and my channel is Professor Oriaso Dongo Knowledge Hub. Welcome and welcome again. Thanks.